So let's get started. Let's talk about business case versus use case. And I think in IT, we can sometimes confuse the two. In IT, we're very, very good at coming up with use cases. One of my favorite ones, which is something that I've had to battle with in my own career, is justifying something like a switch upgrade. For IT professionals or network professionals, it's intuitive to know why would you need a switch upgrade. If you're running 6, 7 year old top of rack devices or core data center technology, you've kind of passed on, that 3 tier design, and we're going into data center fabrics, storage fabrics, all these technologies that enable east-west traffic in the data center. So from a technology perspective, we're pretty clear on the need. The need is one, the switches are old. So if the switches are old, we're going to run into support issues. If the design is old, new applications and the things that you guys have been learning a ton about on the vBrownBag series, automation, we can't do automation with old, or we can't easily do automation with old switches. We can't roll out true DevOps types of operating models. When we look at the nature of traffic, and traffic is no longer north-south, but east-west, that really doesn't support the virtualized data center, cloud-based use cases. So from a use case perspective, we're pretty clear on the problems. However, when you take that problem to a business executive, whether it's your CIO, or if you're in a smaller organization and you're taking the idea directly to your management, your business management team, and the question is asked, okay, what do you need? And you say, okay, I need to spend $150,000 on new data center switches. And the management type looks at you and says, okay, tell me why, I need to invest in your $150,000 switch project. Well, I know I'm still getting email. I'm still being able to access the internet and send and receive collaboration and use Skype and watch YouTube. Why should I give you the 150 grand when the guy in our plant in Alabama is asking for new air conditioning? Those workers are down there sweating. They're working hard. They're making our product. I have a finite amount of resources for projects. You're asking me for 150,000. The plant manager in Alabama is asking me for 150,000. How do I compare those $250,000 requests? So let's talk about the first concept I want to introduce, which is portfolio governance, or project portfolio governance, better known as portfolio management. When does your organization weigh projects against each other? Some organizations have a formal process to do this. They have governance boards, committees that decide on projects. Different stakeholders, whether it's the plant operator in Alabama versus the data center manager in Chicago, brings their packaged business cases to before the feet of that governance committee or project portfolio committee. There's a weight assigned to each business case. It goes through a formal review, and then the committee comes out with recommendations on what projects will be funded and what projects will not be funded. This can also include when ongoing projects that had been approved the year before but are multi-year projects. These projects may get reviewed, a formal review, and determine if they still align with the business goals and whether or not the project is on schedule and worth funding the year forward. And then there's the informal process. You can go to a business leader, whether it's someone within IT, a CIO, director, and you can, make your case for your project. But somehow every organization has some type of project portfolio management, some way of determining what projects get funded. We're going to talk through some of that criteria throughout this session. I'll pause for a second for Twitter questions. All right. Yeah, it can be the no problem. It can be an interesting process, and it can be a frustrating process because naturally we understand. Again, we understand our challenges. If we have 5 or 6 year old servers, or if we have a vSphere cluster that doesn't have enough memory, if we have challenges that hamper the way that we operate our data center, it can be really frustrating when we take our idea to the business and it's rejected, or even when we have a great idea for optimization, which is what we're going to talk about, kind of what things the business values. And this is basically a 400, 500 level business course shrunk into an hour today and then an hour next week. So there's going to be a lot of brevity. I'll kind of highlight the things that you'll need to research out on your own and get a little bit deeper in understanding. And we'll come to these, I think, 3 major points for how most organizations, and I can make this generic statement from working with very small organizations to very large organizations, these 3 core values are how projects are measured and compared to one another. The first, in no particular order, is risk mitigation. So, what risk are you trying to solve? The monetary return of the project. What's the numbers? Some organizations just care about sheer numbers. Are you saving me money? Are you making me money? Are you deferring money? What's the money situation? And then regulatory is just our legal obligation. We have to do this because we're legally obligated to do it. And I think we'll come back to this point, several points throughout this vBrownBag session, which is look towards your performance objectives as a clue. Most organizations, when you go through your formal goals, you have these trickle down goals. The senior VP of your group will have a goal. The director of your organization will have that same goal. Your manager will have that goal, and you'll have that goal. So if there's a goal that's a organizational goal, whether it's a goal throughout your entire company or it's a goal throughout your entire IT organization, that's a pretty good thing to become aligned with. You're going to look at that goal and then look at these 3 different areas: risk, monetary return, and regulatory push to determine if you can get your project kind of aligned with those goals in one of these 3 core measurements. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about risk. It's imperative that you understand what or how your organization defines risk. So you might have gone through kind of courses, whether they're internal or at school, about what's a risk versus a issue. The VMware cluster going down is a issue. The potential of the VMware cluster going down because you lack enough memory in your cluster is a risk. So let's say we want to propose a project in which we increase the amount of RAM that's in the vSphere cluster. We've identified a risk. Something hasn't happened, but something can happen. We'll propose a project to mitigate that risk. We'll spend $100,000 on more RAM. It's pretty funny. I manage a cluster of Itanium based servers, and I just got a quote for 2.5 terabytes of RAM, and the initial quote for like $750,000. Talking about that's just an adjacent. That's just crazy. But let's say that it's $100,000 project. You need to from a high level, and we'll get into monetary in a second. You need to say, okay, there's a risk that we might go down. I'm going to spend $100,000 to mitigate this risk. What was the value of that risk? If the vSphere cluster goes down and the organization doesn't lose any money, spending $100,000 to mitigate that risk really isn't a wise investment of money. You'll probably get your hand slapped and say, you know what, great suggestion, but no, we'll accept that risk. If we're talking about a transactional system, a ERP system, some mission critical piece of hardware application, something that keeps track of someone's vitals in a hospital, then $100,000 is a drop in a bucket to protect the company against that risk, and may be a no-brainer to get it approved. So we're starting early to show how we're mitigating risk and adding business value by proposing projects. We're tying something that we intuitively knew was an issue to something that the business can tangibly measure. Risk is something that most organizations are fairly decent at measuring. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to risk is also when you're proposing a project that mitigates risk, it's a good idea to have some risk of that project associated in your proposal. Every project, no matter how simple that project is, has risk. If you come to a mature management team with a proposal of a project and you don't have any associated risk, you stand a pretty good chance of getting challenged. Let's take our vSphere cluster upgrade, for example. Every time we shut down a server, every time we open a chassis, there's risk associated with doing so. There's risk of having bad memory. There's risk. The risk doesn't have to be great. We can weight that risk medium, high, low. In most cases, doing a simple memory upgrade is low. There's a chance that our predictions on alleviating the memory constraints in the cluster were wrong, and adding memory to the system actually caused more problems than it solved. You'll have a list of risks in your business case, along with steps you're going to take to mitigate those risks. All right, so before we move on, I'll leave a couple of minutes or a few seconds of silence for any questions around risk and risk mitigation. So risk as a central core of a part of your business case proposal. All right, let's go on to, go ahead.
Sorry, there hasn't been any questions on risk. There is one on monetary value, or return. So maybe we'll leave that until after you do this slide. When I'm thinking about this whole risk thing, really what it boils down to it's down to the application, what we're always talking about, right? Or the systems or whatever somebody's relying on, right? I know you talked about hospitals. I'm working in healthcare now. It could be that EMR system, right? That they're using to check people into the hospital. That might be a risk if that goes down.
Exactly. So on both sides. So it may be a risk, you're doing your due diligence, you're monitoring the system, and you notice, hey, you know what? This isn't optimized. And the lack of the optimization may cause either a system slowdown or it may cause a complete failure of the system. You've documented it and it's part of your business proposal. Then on the flip side, as you perform the risk mitigation of the project to upgrade the memory or whatever your optimization is, what's the risk to that application as you perform the mitigation? This is all stuff you should be prepared to discuss when you present your business case.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's talk about monetary. Most of us work in operations roles, so there's very few opportunities for us to increase revenue. It's rare, if we work in a e-commerce type of environment in which we can, show more products per page, or increase the speed at which transactions are conducted, expand the audience via an expansion of the system. Those are rare opportunities in most of IT. Most of IT, we're keeping the lights on. The business has already made the business case for implementing the system. Now it's a question of how do we optimize the system. So again, monetary return. You would think the monetary return piece of it is fairly easy to measure, but it's not. And I'm pretty sure, as John shares the question with me at the end of this, the question is probably around how do you measure monetary return. And this is probably one of the most difficult things to share during or explain during a webinar, because it's so different from company to company. Let's take a really basic use case. And vBrownBag normally does a lot of virtualization. And the argument for virtualization is really normally very easy, which is we used to buy 10 servers. Now we only have to buy one server. We've saved the company the cost of 10 servers. No brainer, you would think. Not so fast. When you go to the accountants, the bean counters, this project portfolio committee or whatever version of who approves projects in your organization, there's a way most organizations measure monetary return. One simple way would be return on investment. If I bought a Nutanix pod, this pod will pay for itself in 6 months. What exactly does pay for itself mean? This is when we get into terms, and I'm hoping there's a bunch of questions throughout this part of the presentation. What's the total cost of ownership of that pod? And then when we break down total cost of ownership, how do we break down total cost of ownership? There's the concept of OPEX versus CAPEX. CAPEX is something when we spend on physical hardware. Most cases, it's easy to, the definition is CAPEX is hardware. OPEX is ongoing operation costs, people, leasing agreements, services, those types of things. CAPEX, OPEX. From an accounting perspective, those things are treated in two different ways. When someone looks at the balance sheet of your organization, they'll say, what's your CAPEX expenses versus your OPEX expenses? High CAPEX expenses can, depending on what investors are looking at for, may not be a bad thing. Let's say you're Amazon and you're building out your AWS cloud, and there's a lot of upfront costs, but you've enabled a lot of automation. So years 1 through 3, you may have a lot of acquisition costs on data centers and hardware, but those costs don't carry over through years 4, 5, and 6. You have a lower OPEX versus capital expenditure. Then there's the weight, something I like to call the weight of money. There's a couple of different ways to weight money. Just like the US dollar has a different value than the euro and the British pound, money that we spend today has a different value than money that we'll spend tomorrow. The theory goes, when we talk about net present value, is money, because of inflation, money is more expensive today than it is tomorrow. The $100,000 that I spend today has the spending value power of $90,000 3 years from now. So when you tell a company that there's a return of, or there's a ROI of 3 years, then the conversation is, oh, well, now you have to look at net present value. You're telling me that I'll make my money back in 3 years. 3 years from now, this investment will look very different. Net present value. Some companies don't care and they don't look at that. They'll just look at, okay, it's $100,000 today. 3 years from now, there's a ROI. That's an interesting way to measure against different projects. Another way to measure against different projects is internal rate of return. So the company might put a value on a dollar invested versus the ROI, and that allows them to compare projects apples to apples. So let's pick on our imaginary manufacturing company again. The guy that wants to upgrade the switches comes through and says, hey, I want to upgrade the switches. Here's the return on investments. Operating our old switches costed this much. Now it's going to cost this much with the old switches. With the newer switches. Well, the finance guy wants to know, how do I compare that return on my dollar versus the air conditioning project? It's things such as internal rate of return that's used to compare those two projects from a monetary perspective. In this area, I highly recommend if you're going to throw a number at an executive, one, put it in the back of the deck, because if you put it in the front, you'll spend the whole meeting talking about the numbers versus the true business value, which is rarely in IT, the dollar amount. And then two, you need to really know what you're talking about when you're talking about some type of return on investment. If your company is a bean counting type of company, work with someone in your accounting department to develop a accurate return on investment based on how your company measures the ROI. All right, so I'll stop for questions. John, did we get any questions on monetary return?
No, we haven't. I mean, I will say often the OpEx is the most difficult one to solidify, to be able to put an answer to. Because, I mean, it's harder to put, at least in my opinion, at least what I've experienced in the past, like, okay, how do I put a number on this person's time, right? Or how do I solidify, yeah, and then you got to factor in things like electricity. Is it co-hosted? Is it, or is it co-load? All these different things. That's the more difficult number. The capex tends to be the easier part, right? And then tying in that business value. I mean, how do you normally approach that? I mean,
And I think that's the part where I'm going to show you guys a trick that I've used throughout my career. I'm giving you guys, we can take this business case discussion and apply it to any part of our industry, any department within any discipline, any business discipline. This isn't IT specific. The guy with the forklifts in the manufacturing plant has to go through the same thing. The air conditioning guy has to make the same argument. The guy who wants to buy new filing cabinets in the finance department, they all have to make the same arguments. The difference becomes, and where this monetary thing, where departments really care about this, is when it comes to projects that, sales, marketing, what we normally call the business or the line of business in our business. So if you work for a drug company and you want to invest in a new line of oncology drugs, then you most definitely will have risk, monetary, and regulatory portions of your business case. IT, we're back office. It's really difficult for us to make a business case based on money, unless it's, as John mentioned, it's a CapEx type of spending. Or if we're in a higher portion of our career and we're going to the CIO and saying that I'm going to get rid of 5 guys in my department if you let me roll out automation. Those are things that we can look at OpEx and look at hard numbers and say that. But if we're not in a position where we're going to the CIO and saying we're going to reduce head count, OpEx is a really tough number to prove. It's that OpEx to me is funny. Is funny money. As a consultant, I can tell you, what happens when you're a director or a CIO and you get OpEx savings wrong. Let's say, and you guys might have seen the symptoms of this in an organization that starts to hire a bunch of consultants to do a bunch of manual work. We've implemented a system. The system was supposed to have created a lot of efficiencies, but these efficiencies never got realized, but the work remains. What companies will do is that they'll shift the budget where we used to spend the money on FTEs. We now spend that money on consultants, which is a different pool of money. It's project based. So the same or similar people doing the same job, but because I promised OpEx savings in the FTE budget, and my project didn't realize those savings, I've had to hire consultants and hide these consultants in my budget to show that I saved the money, the OpEx money that I promised to save. So that's a little inside baseball for you guys when it comes to monetary return on IT projects. OpEx is really, again, for most folks who are proposing, data center type projects, OpEx is a thing that, unless you're in a role where you can guarantee that there's going to be headcount reduction or a elimination. One of my favorite ones is, an easy one for OpEx is reduction of communication costs. That's something that's extremely tangible. I used to spend $100,000 a month on T1 service. I've moved to VPNs, and now I spend $20,000 a month on communications. That's an example of OpEx savings. So if you're spending money on services and your project proposes to save money on services, by all means, go at it at OpEx savings. But if you're not going that, if you're talking about people and you're not in a role where you can actually lay people off, don't go down that OpEx route. All right, and then the last area is regulatory. So PCI, SOX, HIPAA, and FDA, the list goes on and on and on. If you're in the EMEA, APAC, you're going to have similar acronyms for different things. PCI, payment card industry, SOX is Baines and Oxley, the truth in reporting. If you're a publicly traded company, HIPAA is the healthcare information policy, and FDA is the folks that make sure that the drugs we take are healthy for us to take. All of these guys audit organizations that are regulated. If you're a publicly traded company, you have SOX responsibilities. If you're in a publicly traded company, once a year, you have internal or external auditors at least once a year come in and perform SOX audits to make sure that the reporting is tight. Out of these audits may come findings. So let's say that you have one common one is segregation of duty. The person who inputs the bills shouldn't be the one who pays the bills. The person who checks the security logs shouldn't be the person who accesses the system. If a SOX auditor finds a finding for one of your regulatory obligations, that's kind of low-hanging fruit. You can easily say, so it's no longer, I'm not trying to eliminate risk. I'm not trying to reduce costs. we might actually increase risk, we actually might increase cost, but the project must be done because legally we are obligated to remediate this finding. You may find it as, this is where an auditor in some cases becomes your friend. Backup and disaster recovery, a typical area for SOX where SOX becomes our friend is when the SOX auditor comes in and says, you know what, show me your disaster recovery plan. And you give them a sheet of paper that says restore tapes to servers we purchased from CDW in Alpharetta. Bad DR plan. The SOX auditor is going to have a major finding. You might have done that. I've seen people do that by design. So they've tried to run through these projects for approval before, and they've gotten their hand slapped. You get a SOX finding. This goes all the way up to a board of directors when you get a major SOX finding. You can now use this sheet of paper as we're now going to spend $250,000 on a proper business continuity disaster recovery plan. Regulatory is not always something to be feared. It can be a friend when looking for money to perform projects. We'll take a few seconds for questions before we move on to the last slide.
Yep, so far I am not seeing any there. So I think we're good to move on. Yep, I'm not seeing any.
All right. So this is something we're going to actually do. Over the next week, I'm going to develop a business case. I'm going to present a business case that I presented a few years ago, actually, for a publicly traded company that I needed to compete for dollars against the guy that wanted to buy forklifts in Alabama. I didn't make this company that I said is imaginary. Actually isn't very imaginary. This is a company that I worked for that I had to go to. It was a publicly traded company. I had to go to the CEO, the presidents of each business unit, and asked for not a few million, it was a little bit less than that, but a significant amount of money to upgrade the WAN infrastructure. We were on a hodgepodge of disparate frame relay technologies, some of them managed by the telcos, some of them managed internally, some of it was point to point. It was a distributed IT team, decentralized. They had their own autonomy. So we're talking about a full-on IT transformation project. I was the data center manager or network manager for the holding company that ran all these different companies, and I had to go into a office full of executives, put on a PowerPoint and say, this is why you should spend all of this money to upgrade your infrastructure and deny the guy that wants the forklifts in Alabama his forklift. I'll be the bad guy. I had to go back to Alabama after that and talk to that plant manager as we upgraded his systems and talk. And he like, dude, this is my year to get my forklifts, and you're here bringing my plant down for a weekend as you upgrade systems. So that will be the next week's story, me recapping how I convinced a room full of non-IT executives to give me and another team a couple of $1 million. So presenting your case, and we'll talk about this. The important thing is to know your audience. So I framed the audience. Do I need to put together a formal deck? Do I need to present a project? Are we a big SAP shop and I have to go through all these SAP screens, put together all these fields, enter the details for risk, monetary return, regulatory issues? Do I have to put all of this information into a system that gets formalized and sent up to a committee? Do I just have to put together a really well-formed email? Are we a small organization, and you've taken some of these tips and tricks from this session and say, okay, from a high level, I understand that when I ask for more money or money to upgrade the data center switches, I need to come back with a business value. And maybe it's not the three different areas that Keith talked about. Maybe it's specifically something aligned to my goals. One of my goals for the year was to show innovation. And that's low hanging fruit. I know that the CIO had a objective on his review or on his goal list to show innovation. The senior VP had one. My director has one. I have one. And this is kind of low hanging fruit. If I can put together a well worded email talking about how the nature of IT and data centers changed, I'm using all these fancy words like cloud computing, DevOps, and cloud native applications for cloud native environments for building next generation applications, and that's all enabled by a new data center fabric. Hey, you know what? You probably earned yourself a $500 gift card in addition to getting your project approved. Or is it really informal? You just, you know what? I know from a high level, I can just write this thing. I need $50,000 to upgrade the firewalls. I'll write it on a Post-it note and put it on my director's screen. And it's just that informal. But know your audience. Know who you need to present to. It may be just as simple as your director saying, hey, what's the projects that you have on your list this year so that I can put them in my budget? Normally, those types of low-hanging fruit, you don't need the help of a business, someone who knows how to do business cases. Those projects, you know how to get approved. Those are just the ongoing cost of running your environment. Now, I promised a trick the last slide, and this is the trick. If you want to get a major initiative passed, I'm not talking about upgrading the firewalls. I'm not even talking about a data center core switch projects. Those things in the scheme of things are really small. Depending on the size of your organization, everything's relative. In a large data center, you might need to buy, let's say you go with a legacy 3-tier network design, and you have a core distribution layer and access layer, and your distribution layer switches are 6509s, and you want to replace them with Cisco 7Ks. You know what? Maybe that's $150,000. And that project, and for an organization the size that would have something like that in their data center, probably not that big of a project. But let's say that you want to deploy SD-WAN. Not only is it a expensive project, it's pretty disruptive. You got to hire a team of consultants. There's going to be some OpEx spending. There's going to be some CapEx spending. You're going to have to engage a project manager. There's going to be a formal project put together. This is not a small project for most decently sized organizations. Don't go to your business and say, hey, I can save you money by rolling out an SD-WAN. They're going to look at the project. This is take it with a grain of salt. Not every organization is like this. I've become cynical over my 18 years in IT. But they're going to look at the project and say, you know what? I have to dedicate a project manager to that. I really don't understand this stuff. It works really well as it does today. The numbers that he's given me really isn't that significant when I'm about to spend another $1.5 million this year on Oracle DB licenses. If you got a way to save me on these DB licenses, come and talk to me about that. This is how I get these types of projects approved. Piggyback on a business project. This is, I find it curious when people say, you know what, when we're in IT and we say the business doesn't want to do X or the business has this problem. Unless you're outsourced IT, you're part of the business. You are worthy of a seat at the table. So how do we align ourselves with the business? In infrastructure, we talk about it all the time. Apps rule the world. Apps get whatever they want. Instead of complaining about apps getting whatever they want, why don't we leverage apps get whatever they want? There's a reason in my day job, there's a reason why I support the SAP infrastructure. There's a reason why I chose to be the enterprise architect for SAP. There's not many in my organization. There's not many applications more important than SAP. It's easily a third of our IT budget, and I'm over the infrastructure that runs it. So when I want to do something, I go to the SAP team and say, "Hey, you know what? What's the pain points of your day-to-day job?" So if they say, "You know what, we want to upgrade to SAP HANA because doing our data warehousing is just too slow and we can't react to the needs of the business. The business wants to run these super complex queries. We're using this legacy data warehousing platform. We need a new solution, so we're looking at SAP HANA in-memory database." Legitimate use case. This is a slam dunk. They'll go through those first 4 slides that I showed you. They'll come up with a business case and they'll get it approved. And then you'll be stuck trying to implement SAP HANA on your vSphere cluster that maxes out at 512 gig of RAM per host, when these SAP HANA instances take up 1 terabyte to 1.5 terabyte in memory. And this is not, oversubscribed memory. These things they use all 1 terabyte or 1.5 terabytes of disk space. When that group puts in their budget for hardware and they include the SAP HANA appliance, don't just review the BOM and say, "Yeah, that's all we need." No, it's not. We need that data center. We need to upgrade those 6509s. And this is not, I say it's a trick. It's not a trick. It's not a game. This is you doing your due diligence. If a major project is coming down, if a major application project is coming down, you review your wish list of the things that you want to get done, the major projects, the SD-WAN. If I'm going to implement this is tying it all back together. If I'm going to implement SAP HANA, that changes this whole distributed system. If I have a location in Asia that puts in a query over the WAN, and that query normally takes, let's say it takes 15 minutes to run on a non-HANA database. And now I've upgraded the database to HANA, and this query takes seconds to run, but I'm on a slow WAN link in Asia. Now I've moved the bottleneck from the database to the WAN link, and I didn't take into account that I needed to upgrade the WAN link. You jump onto the business case that the SAP HANA folks are submitting. You have you have a seat at the table. You have a seat at this conversation. It is okay. It is perfectly fine for you to piggyback on these projects because you have to support the application after they're deployed. Now, I'm really hoping you guys have some questions around piggybacking on projects that have been proposed that are not core to the IT infrastructure. I see Dan Barr has mentioned that SharePoint has been his piggyback. And SharePoint is, it's interesting. If you guys have rolled out SharePoint is really, an IT project. That's a collaboration. That's a customer-facing tool. It's a collaboration tool. It's very important. And people throw obscene amounts of money at SharePoint. There's SharePoint administrators built into most lines of business teams. A finance group will have their SharePoint administrator. A marketing group will have their SharePoint administrator. That's a good point, Dan, that even a project like SharePoint is something that is, and let's put this in perspective. When we're talking about these types of projects, the licensing cost for something like SAP HANA compared to your $150,000 switch upgrade or your SD-WAN or your 1 point, let's say SD-WAN, the project is going to cost 1 point something million. And at the end of the day, you're going to save money, improve performance for the SAP HANA installation. It becomes low hanging fruit because I can guarantee you that $1.5 million project to upgrade your SD-WAN or your $2 million project to buy vBlocks, that pales in comparison to the $30 million the application team is going to spend to get their SAP HANA get their environment converted over to SAP HANA, get the appliances stood up, the consulting dollars, the stuff that you ask for from an infrastructure perspective is going to be a rounding error. So we got 5 minutes left. Questions?
At this point, I haven't seen a whole lot. Keith, I think it's all been a lot of really good information. I do like the point around the whole piggybacking thing. That's not something that I've looked at or thought of about as much recently. Well, I mean, now I work for VMware, but even when I was a customer, that was not something. Typically, was okay. We're trying to move this project forward, right? Whether it's an internal automation thing and things of that sort. But I've never really done that piggyback thing. That's a really good idea there.
Yeah, these types of things are career movers. When you start to align yourself with the application team, I'm not saying become an application person, but when you start to align yourself with the goals of the business, not only do you get to do interesting projects, your career becomes fast track. Go back, give it some thought. Think about some of the people who have over the years who have progressed in their career when in traditional industries. What was the tipping point from their career? And most of the time is when they worked a project that added direct or indirect value to the business, when they aligned themselves with something, they stuck their neck out there, they aligned themselves with something that was critical